Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, hours of explosions reported in Syria following alleged Israeli airstrikes on Thursday. Meantime, solo runs ending as quickly as they were announced, right-wing parties reuniting under the pressures from former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And later, Prime Minister Yair Lapid making history as the first serving Prime Minister to attend an official LGBTQ community event. Massive explosions reported some 140 miles north of Damascus over the weekend. Israel alleged to have hit multiple sites affiliated with Iran in Syria, and Russian forces in Syria seemingly clearing the way. Enormous plumes of smoke and flames lighting the Syrian night sky, and explosions reportedly heard for up to 5 hours after a series of allegedly Israeli airstrikes Thursday night. In fact, satellite images revealing that several targets still on fire some 2 days later, and Syrian firefighting teams still working. The strikes targeting a number of ammunitions warehouses belonging to Iran-affiliated militia near the countryside of Hama, as well as the Center for Scientific Research in the Hama region, where Iran develops GPS-guided missiles to be used by the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon. Thousands of Iranian missiles are estimated to have been destroyed. Then 14 casualties are said injured, including at least one Syrian officer and at least 2 civilians, largely due to the secondary explosions of the Iranian munitions. Meantime, the attacks in line with Israeli vows to continue to pressure Iran, both against Iran's nuclear ambitions as well as its network of terror proxies in the Middle East, like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. To that end, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz traveling to the United States for meetings with White House and military officials, and this after Israeli stealth fighter jets were seen flying into Iranian airspace as part of joint military drills with Washington.
Israel's cooperation with CENTCOM and the countries of the region is a game changer for security, stability, and peace in the region, particularly in facing Iran and its proxies. We will continue to deepen our cooperation, expand our activities against Iranian proxies, and make sure that Iran never gains a nuclear weapon.
But most surprising, perhaps, is how Russian forces in Syria essentially paved the way for this attack. Russia removed its S-300 missile defense systems from the area in order to bolster its own forces in Ukraine. But by doing this, Israel was able to swiftly take advantage. The Meisaf and Hama areas, which were targeted, being the primary center for Syrian and Iranian production of rockets and precision-guided missiles. Joining me now with more on the recent strikes against Iran in Syria, Dr. Ori Goldberg from the Lauder School of Government and Diplomacy at the Reichman University. Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for being with us. Now, let's start with the fact that Russia moved its S-300 missile defense systems from the area and allowed, in a sense, Israel to strike. Do you think that this was in any way coordinated with Moscow like other Israeli airstrikes in Syria, or was this likely a complete surprise for the Kremlin?
I doubt it was a complete surprise. I assume some coordination is being undertaken with regard to Russia. However, I don't see anything having changed significantly regarding Israel strikes in Syria. They are mostly tactical, and they are an ongoing game with both Hezbollah, the Syrians, and the Russians. The Russians, before they removed their S-300 batteries, they also condemned Israel's previous strikes in Syria. So everything seems to be exactly the same.
Well, so again, does that then extend to Israel-Russia relations moving forwards? Is there like a cold peace that is growing between Jerusalem and Moscow, or I don't know, how would you characterize it?
There was never a Cold War, so I doubt you can call it
not a cold
peace.
Yeah. Okay.
Israel managed to get some concessions from the Russians regarding its strikes in Syria. The Russians, I don't know if they told Israel that it should be careful, but as I understand the situation on the ground, The Russians are enabling Israelis to do what they can, and whenever Israel steps out of the bounds that Russia defines seemingly on a daily basis, the Russians are happy to condemn Israeli aggression.
Well, so do you think that maybe, because you noted that maybe Israel did coordinate with Russia to a larger degree, perhaps. So do you think that that's in an effort to maybe resume some closer relations with Moscow after the attack earlier along the coast that was dangerously close to Russian assets?
Again, I think this is a game that has been played consistently over a very long period of time. I don't think we're seeing any attempts to resume relations or to renew relations. I think relations are as they have been. Israel has some leeway with Russia to attack targets in Syria. Sometimes Israel goes a little bit overboard. When it does that, it receives very powerful Russian condemnations. However, is that the Russians are convinced that Israel should be allowed to strike in Syria. That helps perhaps keep the Iranians in control. The Russians work with the Iranians, but they're very suspicious of them. And again, I don't see any real change out in the scope of the, not in the Russian response, not in Israeli coordination with Russia. All is as it has been.
All right, now it's been reported that Syria is asking Iran and its proxies not to attack Israel from Syrian territory, leading to Iran apparently retaliating against Israel by striking American bases. But wouldn't this just have the opposite effect than desired? Wouldn't that draw more Western attention?
I think it would. I don't know if the Iranian attack or the Iranian-sponsored militia attacks on American bases were or served as a countermeasure to the Syrian request not to attack Israel. Again, the game in Syria is intensely tactical. There are a lot of players on the ground. There are a lot of interests at stake. There's a tremendous convergence and clash of these interests. And the tactical situation changes almost on a daily basis. Nobody is on track to achieve any kind of broader strategic goal. Everybody is extending attacks and trying to smuggle arms and condemning and supporting the attacks of others. And again, all of this is done on a daily basis. It doesn't seem like there is any real strategic end game in place in Syria.
All right. Well, during meetings recently between Israeli Defense Minister Gantz and American officials this weekend, the United States suggested that it is readying for an offensive with Israel against Iran if need be. Do you believe that to be true, given Biden's apparent hesitance to involve military action abroad? And if so, what do you think that entails? Because the White House didn't really give any specifics.
I don't believe that it's true. I don't think the U.S. is willing to put an option on the table. I don't think the U.S. was ever willing to put a military option on the table. I don't think the Trump administration had a military option on the table. There were all sorts of tactical measures that were deployed, including the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. But a credible military option for which you can read war was never in American interest. Again, not the Trump administrations and not the Biden administrations. I think Defense Minister Gantz.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but then what do you make of the recent report from Saudi Arabia that exposed Israeli jets as breaking Iranian airspace as part of a drill with the United States? Is that just the United States maybe appeasing Israel in a sense then?
Again, I think the United States is willing to grant Israel all sorts of tactical concessions. I think the spirit of the upcoming agreement has already been decided. I think that this is an agreement between the United States and Iran. I think the Saudis are very happy to throw their hat in the ring and try and mix it up with the rest of them. But I think all of this, including the head of Mossad's trip to Washington today, all of this is too little, too late. Israel missed an opportunity it might have had to influence the Biden administration by constantly throwing up roadblocks and obstacles in the Americans' path. At this stage, the Americans are happy to debrief Israel. I doubt sincerely that the Americans are taking Israel's across-the-board opposition to the agreement as a serious element in their considerations vis-a-vis Iran.
All right, Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Moving back to Israel now, right-wing leaders Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich reuniting their parties just a week or so after their split, as former Premier Netanyahu convinces them not to divide their voter base.